Hello and welcome to the Holocaust Museum and Cohen Education Center's Teachers Workshop Series on Genocide. This is session 9. It is on Japan. We will be focusing on Japan between the years 1937 and 1945. My name is Sam Parrish. It's my pleasure to be here working with you today on this 9th session of the Teachers Workshop Series. As always, I would like to thank the Florida Department of Education, their Commissioner's Task Force on Holocaust Education, just known as the Task Force. They have been supportive over the years in helping us to teach teachers how to teach, especially difficult subjects like the Holocaust and other genocides. Likewise, I would like to thank the Merrill Color Educator series with the same focus specifically on here at the museum, having us take that information that we acquire and then pass it on to teachers so they can then pass it on one more time to their students. So thanks to both the Task Force and the Merrill Color Educator series for their support that's been going on for many, many years. Today we're going to focus on Japan. We're looking at the concept of genocide, but we're also looking at the other 3 mass human rights violations, which include crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing. We will certainly see and emphasize war crimes in this particular session. In fact, the focus is going to be on 2 specific events / institutions and on providing activities that are hopefully scalable, I guess the term would be, to be used for middle school, upper middle school, and high school students and beyond. The subject matter is extremely graphic, and it has been for the first 8 sessions, but for one reason or another, it seems like this particular session is even more graphic. Well, the photograph that we're looking at right here on the title page is kind of indicative. And in keeping with that, I have actually toned down the photographs. There are hundreds and thousands of photographs regarding Japan and the Rape of Nanking and Unit 731, which is what we're going to focus on, and the horrific actions that were taken, the brutal treatment that was cascaded onto other people, and so I wanted to avoid that. I don't think it's necessary. I think in a way this photograph really says it all. So as I stated, we're going to focus on the Rape of Nanking, well-known event, and then we're going to focus on an institution called Unit 731, which is there are actually 5 other units. They are chemical, biological warfare units, and they're gruesome, horrific, brutal, and inhumane treatment of others in pursuit of experimentation, scientific experimentation, and improvement in weapons. Again, I would advise to go through this first if you're going to be using this with a student, whether homeschool or alternative school or public school, to go through this. Again, the PowerPoint doesn't have a lot of brutal imagery, but this topic that we'll be dealing with it's brutal. What's interesting is that what we did in the last session, and I think 2 sessions ago, we introduced an author who is something of an expert in this field. His name is R.J. Rummel, University of Hawaii. He has taken the topic of genocide and these other mass human rights violations and actually given it a term of his own invention, which is democide. What's interesting is that per Rummel, Japan doesn't rank within the top 15 regimes in terms of democide lethality. As you look, we see from least to most, and along the way we see Cambodia, and we'll see Cambodia at the end. That's 2 different regimes, but it was under the same time frame. And actually, the Khmer Rouge came before Samrin. But that shows an area that we focused on, and the utter lethality of it. We also looked at Mexico and the Mexican Revolution period. We looked at Turkey and the Armenian genocide. We looked at Yugoslavia, Croatia, specifically during World War II, but then afterwards in a session we called Once Yugoslavia, when we saw Yugoslavia just absolutely rupture, fall apart, and dismember itself. And then again, Turkey under Ataturk is part of the Armenian genocide. So we covered a good portion of this already, and we see that Japan does not rank on this list. Again, Rummel refers to it as democide, and it's a term that involves obviously the government killing any person or people, and this includes genocide, a term that I think is lesser used, politicide, in mass murder. It's possible, as we look at Japan and their actions between 1937 and 1945, that 2.6 million unarmed civilians were murdered. So while we'll reference Rummel's charts, we'll see three more and utilize some of his figures, though not exclusively. We will also use, or more specifically, we will use the United Nations definitions of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing. That's been noted in numerous sessions beforehand. I would advise looking those definitions up. They're very cumbersome, somewhat complicated. They leach over into one another. So while they're defined, three of them are legally defined, ethnic cleansing not. They are a little bit cumbersome to handle. There are elements of it which are physical and also a mental element as well. So the definitions are there on the United Nations website, and I would advise looking at those. Japan doesn't appear on this because the majority of its heinous acts that we're looking at came within the context of World War II and was targeted at Chinese and Allied soldiers and Chinese and other Asian civilians, although most of the victims were Chinese. But this wasn't large enough in number to merit being on this list, despite the shocking, horrendous, vile, and gruesome treatment. In terms of a ranking, it doesn't actually rate as high as we see on this chart, democide lethality. The Rape of Nanking, however, actually merits being ranked alone on this list called Some Major Democide Episodes and Cases. On this table, there are events, again, that we've covered. So for example, where you see Chinese land reform. So where you see Chinese land reform, we covered that. Cambodian, he calls it Cambodian hell, with the killing fields. The Armenian genocide, which we did cover. Of course, we kind of base a lot of this off of the idea of the Holocaust itself. And some of these are events that we've not yet covered, but here we see the Rape of Nanking. And it falls in line down here, again, because the number of people estimated to be killed in that one specific event was approximately 200,000 people. The victims were Chinese soldiers, and once, once the Imperial Japanese Army had run them out of town, out of the city, then they turned on the civilians. Again, this 200,000 is specific to the event we call the Rape of Nanking. And so we will be focusing on that as one of our areas that supports what we're looking at, which is genocide and mass human rights violations. Here's a quote from a correspondent in discussing the rape of Nanking. Quote, "It is the army. You can't know what they are like. You didn't meet those poor peasants who have been brutalized after years in the army. They are permitted to do this. It is worse than that. They are encouraged. It is their reward for taking a town. The officers promise them 3 days to do what they like when a town is captured. They always do. It is because Nanking is so important that you Americans hear about it this time, but it has always been true. It is a universal shame." So a sobering quote that shows that America's interest is what brought the rape of Nanking to the forefront. And it was because Americans were familiar with Nanking. But it was not known at the time, at least to Americans in general, that this was actually an Imperial Japanese Army tactic to take a town and then have a 3-day rape, murder, torture, thievery event to kind of as a reward. Apparently similar, though probably not as long-term, events did take place in other cities. Peking, Shanghai, Hankow, and Canton, where the soldiers were, like we just said, rewarded with pillaging, murder, and raping. In fact, evidence that we would see later at the Tokyo war crimes trials showed that between 1937 and 1945's occupation of China by Japan, approximately 95,000 similar events occurred. Not necessarily as large as the rape of Nanking, but events like that where cities, towns, villages were occupied, and there was a 3-day period where that kind of illicit, vicious behavior was in place of or acted as a reward. So we will see that many more people were killed that fall outside of the war dead. So when we look at the numbers, especially because this is in the context of World War II, we will make sure to differentiate between war dead and non-war dead. Here we see another table that supports a working concept that we have, that totalitarianism is the state of governance or the philosophical approach to governance that needs to be feared. And what we've done along the way is compare these or place them in today's left-right paradigm. We're doing that, as I say in each time, we're doing that not to say, see your team, your side, the left or the right, it has a propensity to commit genocide and some or all of the other mass human rights violations. But it helps us understand, I think, where they end up falling. And so we're looking at the concept of totalitarianism in today's kind of related to today's parlance of the left-right paradigm. So Rummel notes in this table, which he calls democide, again, and power, that totalitarianism is the second highest form of governance represented by his concept of democide. Now, it's interesting how he separates totalitarian and then breaks out other almost sub-philosophies. So could, for example, a communist regime, which he considers the highest in terms of democide, is it possible that a communist regime is totalitarian? Well, of course, I would assume so. Is it possible that a communist regime would be authoritarian? Yes. Democratic? Probably not. But what I don't see on here is, since we're trying to balance this left-right paradigm, and we would mostly consider communists to be on today's left wing, today's left side of the paradigm, that we don't see fascism, which though we discussed and saw, it probably is, it's not really adequate to say right, but for our purposes, we're saying that's right, and I don't see that on here. So that's something to note on this chart. Right, so some consider that the Japanese killing of other people wasn't entirely based on their perceived racial superiority, nor an ideology, though they did consider themselves superior to other Asian peoples. And we'll see in our first activity that will be based on that concept. So did they kill based on racial superiority or ideology? To some degree, yes, but there were other reasons. One being that it was sometimes tactically expedient to do so, or convenient. Sometimes it was for revenge or to send a message as an example to others. And unfortunately, in a sickening way, it was also, I believe, also for the sheer visceral pleasure of murdering, of tormenting, of assaulting others. There are some culturally significant reasons included, which is absolutely not a valid excuse, but it is interesting to look at. One of those was their consideration of cowardice. Japanese soldiers were sworn to and were disciplined to fight to the end, which meant to their death. When enemy soldiers were captured, they surrendered. Those soldiers were abhorred because of their cowardice, what was seen as cowardice. So those were reasons to kill in some cases. Not bowing, so the same captured enemy soldier not bowing to a Japanese soldier was grounds at times to be killed. For those prisoners of war, and we'll focus on that in an activity as well, but those prisoners of war who were essentially slave laborers who didn't produce enough to kind of balance it out, to make the expense of keeping them worth it. In other words, the return on investment of holding a slave laborer, if the return on investment wasn't worth it, that also was an excuse for or rationale for killing. So we've got a broad range of reasons that the Japanese killed so many civilians outside of a war context. In a gruesome way, soldiers actually practiced on captured soldiers and civilians. They practiced learning how to bayonet on live human beings. They practiced target shooting on live human beings, where a target was actually placed on the soon-to-be victim's chest and was shot. One other thing that's interesting is it was also used in a way to immunize soldiers from recognizing the humanity of the enemy. So here's our first activity, Session 9, Japan, and it's called, and okay, I'm glad this actually came up. I will undoubtedly mispronounce numerous names, Chinese and Japanese, so apologies, it's certainly not intentional. I've heard the pronunciation for this and I'm still gonna get it wrong. It's Hakuishu. That may actually be relatively close. So that's the activity. So first and foremost, have students research this concept of Hakuishu, which is translated in different ways, and it comes down to ideas of at least a perception of superiority by the Japanese. So how does that translate into English? Who came up with the idea? In what ways was the concept used over the years? and especially for our purposes, how was that concept taken and twisted to fit the purpose of what we're calling bad actors or people with bad intentions? We see parallels, of course, in the Holocaust, of taking concepts and twisting them. Also in Yugoslavia during World War II with the Stasi. Now we have a video. It runs 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Now don't be put off at first. There are Italian subtitles that might throw you off, but it is narrated in English, and it covers this concept of Hakuishu. It's, you know, it's YouTube video. Questions then to ask after looking at that video is the video biased toward the Japanese or biased against them? I think it's interesting for students to see bias, which is why I include that kind of concept in different activities over these different sessions. Not all the time, but when applicable. And I believe it is in this case here, as you will see when you watch the video. Also, noting that this is a period video, what terms were used that in today's world would not be acceptable? And I can tell you that the term Jap is used in different videos and in different writings. So today we would say that that's inappropriate. You would say Japanese. The term then was used, and it was a commonly used term. It was used for the most part to denigrate the Japanese. So some other questions. How does the narrator compare sports to Japanese diplomats, the Japanese military, and the Japanese people as a whole? That's kind of an interesting part of this short video. And then do the concepts that they refer to in parts A, B, and C, the diplomats, the military, and the Japanese people as a whole, do those concepts align with this idea of Hakuishu? Lastly, they bring in this idea of the Tanaka plan, and they bring that into the video. So this video is kind of an anchor. If the students watch the video, look up this term, and answer the questions, I think they'll have a good feel for the idea of how it was used to demonstrate Japanese superiority. And I think that that's important because in today's world, there is definitely an emphasis on supremacy, specifically white supremacy. So I think it's important for us to maybe take a step even further back from that and just focus on the concept of supremacy. What makes people superior to others? Not individuals on an individual basis, but a people, a race, or an ethnicity. What makes them superior in their minds over others? And you see that throughout history, and you see it across ethnicities and cultures and religions and philosophies. It is definitely much broader, much deeper than white supremacy. The example I've used in the past is about in the Cambodian genocide, the Khmer Rouge specifically looked down upon Chinese and especially Vietnamese based on skin color. But it's not the way we think of it. It was the Khmer Rouge thought that their darker complexion denoted superiority over the Chinese and their lighter complexion and over the Vietnamese as well. So this idea of supremacy based on skin color, supremacy based on race, is one that could be actually worked into this activity. And I think it might be helpful, and I think it might be interesting for students to see. So activity 1 is on Hakuishu, that concept of Japanese superiority and how it was twisted. All right, so where we left off was we were talking about the rationale that the Japanese used for killing, and it ranged from supremacy to practice to fun to looking down upon soldiers for their cowardice and other reasons as well. An interesting note is that camps were not set up to house Chinese POWs, prisoners of war. Why would that be? the answer is obvious, and it demonstrates what we're talking about these rationales for killing. Camps weren't set up because, generally speaking, Chinese POWs were tortured and then killed or used for slave labor. An estimate from the Tokyo War Crimes Trials suggested that 1 million Chinese POWs were murdered. Now, that was on the high end. Research afterwards reduced the number, and as always, our numbers are, we have a broad range. We have a low to a high. We always consider who is saying the low end. Is it in the, to show favor for them? On the high end, is it to show disfavor, depending on their perspective? Well, the number that was agreed or has been agreed upon and accepted is 400,000 murdered Chinese POWs, supporting the idea that camps were not set up because they weren't needed. So now we're going to focus on the rape of Nanking specifically. But before we do, I wanted to take a look at this last chart by Professor R.J. Rummel. He put together this enormous list, broke it down by different names: mega murderers, lesser mega murderers, suspected mega murderers, centikilo murderers, and even subcategories within. So it's a little bit complicated, but this will show what we're looking at in the scale of 20th century genocides and human rights violations. We looked at the People's Republic of China. We looked at the Kuomintang, and we see listed 5th is Japan for 20th century democide. Now they go back to 1936. And we're looking at approximately 6 million people. Interestingly, Rummel and his team note that there was virtually no domestic killing, as we know. We said mostly mostly Chinese soldiers, Chinese civilians, and the enemy. That it was not genocide, and I don't think there's a question about that. The point is, this is war crimes, crimes against humanity, and maybe to a degree ethnic cleansing. So that's where that's where Japan fits on this overall massive list, right after Russia, the Holocaust, and China. So this is significant. Again, we could look through footage and photographs that are heartbreaking and disgusting. And I didn't think that was appropriate. I didn't think it was right. And I think this memorial sculpture that we'll look at captures the sense, captures the terror, the dismay, the death, the destruction, and it does so in a graphic way through sculpture. So I think that picture is a little bit more palatable for our purposes. All right, so the rape of Nanking. Well, this is absolutely war crimes. And in part, this is inspired by a sense of superiority, which automatically almost lends itself to genocide and ethnic cleansing, which we'll see, especially when we do a brief focus on the Philippine Islands, that the killing was ethnically based. All right, so when was this? The rape of Nanking took place starting in December of 1937, and then it lasted for 6 weeks. Remember, we said 3 days. This lasted for 6 grueling weeks. At the time, right up before that, Nanking's population was somewhere around 1 million. It was, at that time, the capital of China, and therefore it had a lot of foreign diplomats and business people and missionaries. news correspondents and the like there. There are estimates, as we said, from a low of 40,000 to a high of 300,000. And we reckoned, based on Rummel and others, that the number that's probably best for us to use is 200,000 people. It's interesting because these numbers come in part from some different groups who shortly after counted the bodies and buried them. One were what are called, and I'll absolutely, I'm sure I'll butcher this name, so apologies, but Sung Shantang teams. They counted and buried approximately 112,000 people post what we now call the Rape of Nanking. Another group counted and buried 43,000, and their name is the Red Swastika Society. And so that brings us to a second activity. All right, so session 9, Japan, and the activity is the Red Swastika Society. So first and foremost, I think it's easy to find a picture of a red swastika related to this organization, not to the one we think of. And that might be a great way to start this activity, is to just show that swastika and say, how does this relate to World War II? Students will answer it. Then you could have the students research the Red Swastika Society. I think if you just left it as that, the Red Swastika Society, they would still think that this is something to do in Germany, but this is the Red Swastika Society of China. I've provided some links down below here for us to look at. So I would think that they could put together a small report outlining kind of the basics, the who, what, when, where, why, and how. When was it established? How was it formed? What was their mission statement? In using these and other, certainly other websites, this link here has the red swastika, and you'll note that it's the Buddhist style of swastika, not the Nazi version of the swastika. But some information in both of these. This Buddhism and Daily Living WordPress article provides a lot of very detailed information, and then this answers a little bit more of what we're looking for. So have students kind of expand that research perhaps to include discovering the history of the swastika. In fact, I've put together a presentation on the swastika, the history of the swastika in America before World War II. And that could be an offshoot or a separate activity altogether. There are incredible photographs of the swastika in America, which included the 54th U.S. Infantry patch. That was a patch that was on an American infantry unit until the Nazis co-opted and corrupted the swastika shape. At that point, because they were out west, I think in New Mexico, they actually changed, New Mexico or Arizona, they changed their patch from a swastika to a phoenix rising. But the swastika in America beforehand was used on postcards, team logos, in fashion. There's a Coca-Cola keychain using the swastika, car company logos, and tons more. And I put this, that this is surprising, educational, and kind of fun to look through. There's crates of oranges with a swastika on it as part of the Orange Company logo. The swastika in American history before World War II was a symbol of fortune and good luck. Students would bring teachers, if they knew that it was a favored teacher's birthday, they would bring a birthday card, have all the kids sign it, and they would present it to the teacher. And a lot of times that card would have a swastika shape on it saying, "Teacher, we love you. We appreciate what you're doing. We wish you good luck and fortune." So the Red Swastika Society, you'll end up learning, is not dissimilar to the Red Cross or the Red Crescent. Very interesting activity potential. So in terms of raw numbers, that's what we were looking at. We said the Sungshan Tang teams counted and buried 112,000. The Red Swastika Society, 43,000. Somewhere between 20,000 and 80,000 women were sexually assaulted. We've talked about that briefly. We've really feel uncomfortable going into it, but that how rape is a weapon and tactic of war, and how it is clearly spelled out as a violation of human rights per the United Nations and per common sense. More, the city's infrastructure was about a third of it was absolutely totaled through looting and burning. Later, after this event took place, the Japanese military leadership advised soldiers not to tell stories about the rape of Nanking and other events similar to that. To wit, we have a quote. So here is a captured top secret information that was transmitted to Army commanders. Quote, one company commander unofficially gave instructions for raping as follows. So here's a quote within this quote. In order that we will not have problems, either pay them money or kill them in some obscure place after you have finished, end quote. If the Army men who participated in the war were investigated individually, they would probably all be guilty of murder, robbery, or rape. But because this, end quote, because this is in the context of war, it's seen as a tactic. And again, as we said, it was offered as a reward. Later on, the same document refers to prisoners taken from the Chinese army, sometimes being lined up in one line and killed to test the efficiency of the machine gun. That is very reminiscent of what was taking place in the Western theater, especially in Eastern Europe, with the Nazis and their allies using human beings for target practice and actually to test efficiency of shooting. I mentioned earlier or previously that Nanking was the capital, and it became the capital under Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist movement that was mentioned. We covered China in the last two sessions. We actually had to break it down because it was so large of a topic that we broke it into two sessions. So Chiang Kai-shek moved the capital to Nanking. Now, when the invasion by Japan was imminent, Shek actually removed his troops. He left auxiliaries there. He forbade evacuation, but he removed his troops, essentially sacrificing the city of Nanking, the small military that was there, the small military contingent that was there, and the civilians as well. There was a small group of Western businessmen and missionaries, and they also realized that this was imminent, so they set up the International Committee for Nanking Safety Zone. In other words, they set up a neutral zone within the city. In terms of size, they say it was equal to New York City's Central Park. So it was an enormous neutral zone. Well, the troops, the Japanese Imperial Army, arrived December 13th, but news was arriving beforehand of what was taking place along the way, including killing contests, rape, and pillage. The Japanese at first agreed to respect the international zone, that neutral zone, but in January ended up declaring that the city had been restored, its order had been restored, therefore making the international zone unnecessary, and therefore it was able to be dismantled. Well, the killing and the rape actually continued into February. A puppet government was then set up there and actually remained in place throughout the war. So this is from December of 37 all the way to the end of the war in 1945. Two soldiers, and specifically tied to the rape of Nanking, were tried: General Matsui and Lieutenant Hisao, H-I-S-A-O. I would suspect it would be Hisao or Hisao. They were tried, Matsui and Hisao were tried and convicted of war crimes. by the International Military Tribunal, the IMT, for the Far East. And they were executed, those two. So today, or since, some Chinese have used it as, in terms of propaganda, anti-Japanese propaganda. And to be fair, there are some Japanese who actually deny that the event took place. Hard to believe on either hand that the Chinese would use that as propaganda against the Japanese today. It took place 70 plus years ago. It's also inexplicable to think that some Japanese would deny that. But then again, as we've seen along the way in Stanton's 10 stages of genocide, that the 10th and final stage of genocide is denial. Well, we've talked about the rape of Nanking. There's another activity that comes up, and it's on a similar but way less known event called the Rape of Manila. So here we have session 9, Japan, the Rape of Manila. And by the way, all of these activities are in the folder on our website, where you found the link to the video that you're watching. So all of this is located within that folder. This activity called the Rape of Manila. Well, first and foremost, I think for students, it would be important for them to locate Manila on a map and to identify it as the city capital of the Philippines. I would have them gather information on what life was like in the Philippines, in Manila, before World War II and Japanese occupation. There is a video called Manila, Queen of the Pacific, 1938. It runs nearly 11 minutes, and at first there are some really glitchy technical issues, but then it plays well. And note, there's also an ad or two. But the video footage is really amazing. And so that brings a question. I mean, how would a student describe Manila in 1938? And based on the imagery and maybe the pride that's demonstrated by the Filipinos, were they justified in thinking that their country would flourish in the future, not knowing, of course, what was coming their way soon? After you've seen, or after the students have seen Queen of the Pacific, to see the beauty and the energy and the excitement in Manila in the Philippines, there's a short 2.5-minute video called Manila Retaken. And so this is exactly what you would expect. It's the war footage. It is graphic. And I would definitely preview that before showing it to students. Questions being, how are the Japanese actions referred to by the narrator? Again, is there bias in there? Is there anger in there? Would it be justified if the narrator took some liberties, maybe? Based on the students' knowledge of the Rape of Nanking and then researching the Rape of Manila, would they conclude that the narrator's description was accurate? And they could do this by comparing data such as the dates of occupation, the length of the occupation, the number of Japanese troops involved, the number of residents murdered, the number assaulted, and the aftermath of the city's infrastructure. Here is another quote, and this actually brings up that idea of Hakuishu that we mentioned in Activity 1. This is a quote from a scholar of Japan, and his name is David James. He was a scholar of all things Japanese. He was also a Japanese POW at one point. What he wrote was, quote, Japanese atrocities have their genesis in the Hakuishu of the Nippon Shoki, the oneness of the Japanese national family, the unity of Tenno, state and people. No matter what a Japanese, that's a Japanese person, no matter what a Japanese may do to a foreigner, he acts as one of the national family. For that simple reason, one Japanese will refrain from interfering with the action of another Japanese, even when he knows that it is immoral. even absolutely contrary to his own moralism, end quote. In support of what we've talked about in terms of cowardice, Tojo, when speaking before the International Military Tribunal, noted that quote, the Japanese idea about prisoners is different from that in Europe and America. In Japan, it is regarded as a disgrace, that is, to be captured. Under Japanese criminal law, anyone who becomes a prisoner while still able to resist has committed a criminal offense, the maximum punishment for which is the death penalty. In Europe and America, it is different. A person who is taken prisoner is honored because he has discharged his duties. But in Japan, it is very different, end quote. That's Tojo. An American chaplain named Captain Francis P. Scott interviewed many convicted Japanese POW camp commandants to figure out why they treated their prisoners the way they did. And his conclusion was they had a belief that any enemy of the emperor could not be right. So the more brutally they treated their prisoners, the more loyal to the emperor they were acting. So we take this information now we've seen with the rape of Nanking and then this activity, the rape of Manila, and kind of maybe broaden it a little bit. Not to be forgotten was this continued similar tactic in other occupied countries, not just China. For example, the Philippines. So they were, of course, they were allegedly ordered to perform these atrocities. And this tactic or approach spread from island to island, and the numerous islands of the Philippines alone, let alone all the other Pacific islands. So this idea spread island to island. And I actually, my mother-in-law, as a personal anecdote, is Filipino, and she was there. And she recalls the Japanese soldiers coming into their village and the family fleeing through rice paddies for their lives, with the emphasis on the girls escaping and hiding, because this concept, the knowledge that the Japanese soldiers would use rape as a weapon and a reward system was well known by then. So more on the treatment of the Filipino people. This is a quote from a captured Japanese diary. This is a soldier, unidentified. Quote, taking advantage of darkness, we went out to kill the natives, that is the Filipinos. It was hard for me to kill them because they seemed to be good people. The frightful cries of the women and children were horrible. I myself killed several persons. Another soldier, another captured Japanese diary. This is from a Japanese officer, said, quote, we are ordered to kill all the males we find. Our aim is to kill or wound all the men and collect information. Women who attempt to escape are to be killed. All in all, our aim is the extinction of personnel, end quote. That's that one statement, though it doesn't necessarily turn the tides and make this a genocide, is a genocidal type statement, to be sure. Homes were burned, valuables were stolen. This behavior we would also see taking place in the Western theater at the same time, and we would see in the numerous other events that we've talked about, from Mexico and the Mexican Revolution, the Cambodian genocide, the Armenian genocide, Yugoslavia during World War II, Yugoslavia post World War II in the 90s and 2000s, and the breakup of Yugoslavia, and in China in both sessions, this same type of treatment, killing the men, wounding the men, extracting information. Why? Because the men were likely to fall to fight back. All right, so later the United States military units documented Philippine atrocities that were foisted upon the Filipino people, and they estimated that between 89,000 and 91,000 civilians were murdered. Similar activities took place courtesy of the Imperial Japanese Army. Similar numbers occurred in the Dutch East Indies and its numerous islands, in Malaya, in French Indochina, in Singapore, in Manchuria, and other islands. Totaled, including the Philippines, in terms of civilians who were just outright murdered, as the man said, personnel, exterminating personnel, somewhere between 1.6 million and 4 million. That doesn't include the numbers that were killed as part of slave labor, which included civilians and POWs, which is a direct violation of war crimes, by the way. And that included Koreans and Indonesians. So this idea of superiority of the Japanese over all of the other Asian peoples is demonstrated by this treatment from the Philippines north all the way to Korea and to Manchuria. The treatment of POWs alone resulted in over 25,000 US POWs being taken captive, with at least 10,000 dying. And that brings up another activity that I think could be of interest to students. All right, so that brings up an activity, Session 9 Japan, called the Bridge Over the River Kwai activity. That name may strike a memory chord somewhere, and that's because there's a movie, The Bridge Over the River Kwai. So that might be of interest for students to watch. First and foremost, a movie from 1957, and the movie being the British movie, The Bridge Over the River Kwai. Then have students research what really happened to prisoners who worked along the Burma-Thailand Railroad construction. It's something like 250 miles of construction through dense jungle. And of course, with an emphasis on the treatment of prisoners. Then answer these questions. What is slave labor? Who was used as slave labor? Where is this actual bridge? Is there an actual bridge over this River Kwai? Was it destroyed or is it still intact? Did soldiers and civilians die building the Burma-Thailand Railroad? And if so, and the answer is yes, how many? Is the movie an accurate descriptor of the torment of the prisoners who worked on the railroad? And then a question again, we talk about bias and so forth. Why would the Japanese, because they were offended by this movie, why would they have been offended by it? So I mentioned that there were 25,000 plus US POWs. There were twice that, 50,000 plus British POWs, with something like at least 12,000 of them dying. So all Allied forces totaled nearly 140,000 POWs who died under Japanese captivity. An estimate of civilians and POWs combined may have been as high as 10.6 million. More than likely, the number is closer to that number we already mentioned, which is approximately 6 million. So let's consider the treatment of POWs, which falls under war crimes. And I think the movie Unbroken, and I think the general idea is that the Japanese treated POWs horrifically. So here's an activity. Here's an activity, Session 9 Japan, the treatment of POWs. This is interesting. Just one segment, one violation that the Japanese did use was to transport prisoners in unmarked conveyances. In other words, ships that weren't marked. They weren't marked with, for example, a red cross that said we have prisoners on board. I would have students research the Japanese ship Junyo Maru. I've also seen it as Junior Maru, but I would do a search for it under Junyo Maru. Then there's a 1 minute and 37 second movie, a YouTube video. Here's the link. The narration is computerized, and so the word POWs instead sounds like instead of POWs, it's POW. So it's kind of hard. It's POW, pow, and so it's a little off-putting. But once you get past that, very interesting to see about the ship. And then there's another video. It's about 2 minutes and 36 seconds, and there's more than likely going to be an ad. It's another YouTube video, but it covers this idea of the Junyo Maru. And then a follow-up to that is this the only ship, the only time this kind of thing happened? Absolutely not. So what ships carried prisoners of war in an unmarked state? Then, going back to our first session where we noted about the Geneva Protocols, Geneva Convention, how does this directly violate those protocols in the convention? Did prisoners only die when the ship was disabled or torpedoed? And ships were torpedoed often by the Americans and the British. They were attacking Japanese military ships, and they were not advised in any way that there were British, American, and other Allied soldiers on board. So did prisoners die just from the ship being struck? And the answer, of course, the reason I've asked that question is because the answer is no. So I would have the students then research a ship called the Oryu Maru, best pronunciation I can come up with, Oryu Maru. So how were prisoners who were struggling for their lives in the water after their ship had been blown up, torpedoed, how were they treated? Were they taken aboard as people are supposed to be when they're at sea, or were they instead gunned down and worse? Then use those definitions that I mentioned in the beginning, the United Nations definitions of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing to identify which of these would include transporting POWs on unmarked ships. All right, so let's switch gears now. We've covered kind of an overview of Japanese attitude and focused then specifically on the Rape of Nanking, and we introduced probably four different activities. Now, I mentioned that the Rape of Nanking is well known, though the details may not be. The general idea, I think, is this is much lesser known, and this is the other thing, the second half of what we're going to focus on, and that is, I'm just calling it Unit 731, but just so we're accurate, there were actually 6 of these biological chemical warfare units. They were Unit 731, Unit 100, Unit 516, Unit 1644, Unit 1855, and Unit 8604. Not sure about the derivation of these unusual numbers, but those are the 6. And what we're going to look at as we focus mainly, almost specifically, almost exclusively on Unit 731 is war crimes and crimes against humanity. What we're looking at here are the remains of the actual Unit 731 building. And that's quote unquote today. And if you look, you'll see electric poles, you'll see modern day buildings. And one of these, I believe, is a middle school, and it may be this one right here. Note the railroad track as well. That's a little bit similar to things we've seen with the Holocaust. All right, Unit 731. Well, first and foremost, those people who were used or killed for bacteriological and chemical weapons testing will be covered here. This concept, these biological chemical warfare units were established in 1938, pre-World War II, Western theater for sure, and this is still the conflict between Japan and China. So it was established in 1938 in occupied China, and it was established to develop biological weapons. That was its mission. It had a secret research school that was in Tokyo. So while secret, it still was in Tokyo, meaning that surely people knew beyond the walls of what was happening in there. This continued research into bacteriological weapons that actually had begun back in the 1920s. Not unlike the Nazis, there was a euphemistic name for it. It was euphemistically referred to as Anti-Epidemic Water Supply and Purification Bureau of the Kwangtung Army, later to be known as Unit 731 of Manchuria. Now, where did these people come from who worked here? Well, not unlike the Nazis and doctors in concentration camps, They came from colleges and universities who supplied doctors and other research staff. Approximately 3,000 prisoners, Chinese, Russian, Mongolian, and Korean mainly, died from Unit 731 experiments. The findings from the experiments by Unit 731 ended up leading to the death of 300,000 plus people throughout China. So the direct experimentation killed 3,000 people, 3,000 guinea pigs, and led to the death of 300,000 plus civilians and presumably soldiers as well. Scientists deliberately infected prisoners with the following: anthrax, plague, cholera on those 3,000 civilians and soldiers who'd been imprisoned. Experimentation, and this again is a graphic warning alert. Experimentation included vivisection without anesthesia. In other words, cutting open a person's body and exploring the organs and the effects of these different chemicals and different experimentation on organs while a person was alive, while a person was not anesthetized. So experimentation included vivisection without anesthesia, subjection to intense growing building pressure in chambers. Not unlike the Nazis' experimentation involving hyperbaric type chambers, which were designed to test altitude issues for German Luftwaffe pilots. Well, the Japanese experimentations, these intense growing pressures in these chambers concluded when the subject's eyes popped out. Other experimentation included exposure to freezing temperatures to see the effects of frostbite. Some prisoners were tied to posts and then exposed directly to biological weapons. Some quote unquote bombs, little devices, were loaded with plague infected fleas, and then the bombs were thrown at the prisoners so they could be exposed to plague infected fleas. Another bizarre, as if those weren't bizarre enough, another bizarre experiment was using massive doses of tetanus vaccine, and that was administered on, again, these guinea pigs, these involuntary guinea pigs, to see how long it took for the victim to die. And observers actually recorded the dying prisoner's movements and spasms. They tested gases and poisons directly on people. They tested the effects of electrification, and they even secretly infected prisoners' drinking water and food. Of course, these records, unlike a lot of the German Nazi soldier scientists' records, these records were destroyed. So there is most assuredly other experimentation that we don't even know about. My question is, how on earth could scientists and doctors, especially who presumably took an oath to do no harm, how could they, and even soldiers to a degree, do such horrific things to other people? And it's by removing the humanity from the person. So when we look at the Western theater and the Nazis, we use an example of Babi Yar. Babi Yar was a ravine in Ukraine where 30,000+ Jewish residents of Kiev were rounded up, taken to a ravine, and then shot, assaulted, beaten, tormented, tortured, and then shot and killed in a 48-hour period. The takeaway by the Nazis, by Nazi leadership, was twofold. One, that it was a waste of bullets, and two, that the people, the killers, who in many cases volunteered for this, actually started to experience negative psychological effects in that they noticed the humanity of the people they were killing. In other words, they were up close. And that's why this idea of poison gas and removal, physical distance from the killing became so prominent in the Western theater. Well, here we see that avoided, that idea that the prisoners are people or patients. They were not referred to as people or patients, but a Japanese term, maruta, M-A-R-U-T-A, which is Japanese for wooden logs. So the humanity was completely extracted and negated from these people who became involuntary guinea pigs. They were no longer even guinea pigs, they were wooden logs. Well, units 731 and 100, unit 100 as well, were charged specifically as biological warfare research centers. And this is in spite of the Geneva Protocol of 1925, something we referenced in session 1, which directly forbade biological and chemical warfare. That was in the aftermath of World War I and mustard gas and chlorine gas and other horrific chemical warfare, chemical weapons. So they did that directly in spite of the Geneva Protocol. Well, this site that we're looking at was destroyed at the war's end, as the war was coming to an end, not specifically at the end, but as it was winding down and as Japanese loss was becoming obvious, they destroyed the building. Again, not unlike the Western theater, where the fleeing Germans destroyed to the best of their abilities, destroyed the concentration camps, got rid of any bodies they could, even to the point of doing death marches to move prisoners that could walk further into Germany and away as evidence, destroyed the crematoria to the best of their ability as well. Same thing here. Unit 731 destroyed this site as the war's end and the loss became evident. So it's kind of like Ohrdruf. If you've pictured that Ohrdruf photograph where Eisenhower, Patton, and Bradley are standing looking down on remains, the Germans attempted to create an impromptu funeral pyre, but the temperatures were nowhere near high enough. And so what you end up having are charred remains, charred logs, and charred human beings that did not hide the evidence, but just in fact made the Nazi actions even worse. Not unlike Ohrdruf, the remaining prisoners who were here were shot. There were approximately 400, and they were summarily executed. And the employees of that facility were sworn to secrecy. Bizarrely and shockingly, and that is saying a lot considering this topic thus far, mice, lab mice, were released from the laboratories, and they ended up spreading out, traveling, and carrying plague into different parts of China, which led to an additional killing of some 30,000 people, mostly civilians, more than likely soldiers as well. Few of those involved with this Unit 731 ever admitted guilt. Worse, perhaps, is that none of the Japanese scientists, not one of them, was ever brought to trial in Japan. Instead of being punished for these grievous and vile acts, they were actually given a secret deal by the American administration, this is under Truman at the time, which directed General Douglas MacArthur to grant all of the Japanese scientists immunity in exchange for details, findings, and data. This was in 1946. This is fresh after the war has ended. The US administration justified it as part of what had already begun, which was really beginning by the growing last year or two of World War II. That is the Cold War versus the Soviet Union. So in a way, not unlike Operation Paperclip with German scientists getting immunity and coming to the West, this data, this information came to the West, meaning that these people got away with literal mass murder. For the most part, General Shiro Ishii, who was the guy who headed up Unit 731, got away with it. He lived near Tokyo until his death in 1959. I mean, it wasn't like he was hiding or living in obscurity. In 1940, this same general, Ishii, directed a germ warfare unit in at least 2 battles. The result being thousands became ill and hundreds died. There was a colonel named Ota Kiyoshi who led a unit that dropped plague-infested cotton fibers, fabric cuttings, wheat, rice, and fleas from airplanes. That resulted in the death of at least 7,600 people. He got away with this. In September of 1942, a different unit, Unit 1644, dispersed anthrax, typhoid, and plague from airplanes. That resulted in, untold, heavy casualties, untold numbers. Hard to quantify that. In May of 1942, troops used cholera, which then, I think it was a couple months afterwards, led to an outbreak that swept across 58 counties in a province, the Yunnan province. 2.5 months later, 120,000 people had been infected and were ill, and more than 90,000 died. Hisato Yoshimura, he was the man in charge of the frostbite experiments that I briefly mentioned, went on to occupy key medical posts and other public and private posts. Yoshisuke Murata was the man in charge of vivisections. Gruesome. There are gruesome photographs, accessible. The man in charge of that ended up becoming the director of Kyoto University's medical school. Others went on as well to continue their careers. One became a governor of Tokyo. Another became the president of the Japanese Medical Association, and various roles at medical schools and within the government. All of this, Unit 731 plus the other 5, biological and chemical warfare units, engaging in battles, utilizing wooden logs, involuntary human beings as guinea pigs. Not one prisoner survived. Later, in 1982, China created a museum that's there. All right, so some random notes, and this we've been using what I call the governance tracker by genocide and mass human rights violations. What we have done is we've looked at the different genocide / mass human rights violation by location. If needed, if it was segmented, we gave it different sub-names by date, by the system of governance. We put that each on the left-right paradigm. If the country in question actually changed name, so for example, the Khmer Republic became the Democratic Kampuchea, which became Cambodia, we looked and we asked the question, was this ultimately totalitarian? And if we look, we see an awful lot of yeses scrolling by. Lots of yeses for this question of totalitarianism. We listed the people in charge. We listed the numbers killed attributed to those people. And then we asked the question, was it genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, or ethnic cleansing? Later, we added this column for religious intolerance because that became evident in a couple of these different events, these genocide, mass human rights violations events. Then we added something that's absolutely not quantifiable, but I added the column based on what I read about people's treatment of other people. Was a lack of human respect. Could it be so simple as being religiously intolerant and lacking respect of one another? Is that an indicator? All right, so then we scroll down through Cambodia, Mexico, Yugoslavia, then this, which was titled Once Yugoslavia because it covered numerous countries as Yugoslavia balkanized, Armenian genocide, China, the second half of China, and that brings us to Japan. 1937 to 1945. The name I gave it was Inhumanity on Display, though, because it was one period, one solid period, it really didn't require a subcategory name. Again, the years. Now, I put National Socialists. It's a tough one. Japan is a tough one. But in a sense, they were National Socialists in that they believed in a nationalized economy, and they certainly had centralized control over society. So in a way, they were nationalists and socialists. Well, we've looked at this before. We've looked at nationalism. We've defined it. We've maybe kind of opened our eyes a little bit about what nationalism actually is. And if you put these together, really, nationalism is something we associate, whether fairly or not, with today's right, and socialism, accurately or not, we associate with today's left. So I put it down as being either both or in the middle of today's left-right paradigm. I guess it's for other people to decide, but that seems to take into consideration both elements, the nationalism element and the socialism element. The name was the Empire of Japan. Were they totalitarian? Yes, ultimately they were. Now, who was the political leadership, the political or military leadership? Konoe Fumimaro, Tojo Hideki, who I mentioned, and Hirohito. Konoe, which I'm sure I'm getting wrong, was prime minister from 1937 to 41. Tojo Hideki, known as Tojo, who was quoted earlier, was prime minister from 41 to 44, and then Hirohito was the emperor. Numbers killed, I've mentioned. We've seen a high of 10 plus million and a low. We kind of estimate it to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 million people. Again, these are not war deaths, soldiers. These are civilians or soldiers who were used post their ability to fight as soldiers. They were POWs or slave laborers. Was this a genocide? No, I don't think there was anything that indicates genocide. Was it crimes against humanity? Unequivocally, yes. And if you look at the definition of crimes against humanity on the United Nations website, I think you'll concur. War crimes, without question. Ethnic cleansing, yes. I touched just briefly on the sense of superiority that the Japanese had. And again, it wasn't necessarily always racially, but in terms of the Filipinos, it was an ethnic type of cleansing. Keep in mind that, as you'll see on the United Nations website, ethnic cleansing is not a legal definition. I say this each time. We have a sense, certainly, of what it means, of what it feels like, but it is not a legal definition as of now, according to the United Nations. Is this based on, was there a noticeable religious tolerance? I don't think that comes up. Was there a lack of human respect? I don't think there's any question whatsoever. And if we look, we see that in Japan, in China, in Armenia, in Turkey, often in what was once Yugoslavia. And that's where we began that really informal and non-scientific category. A couple other notes. Japan did not ratify the 1929 Geneva Convention on the treatment of POWs. So they eschewed the 1925 protocol toward that dealt with chemical biological warfare, and they absolutely simply ignored and did not ratify the Geneva Convention in 1929 on the treatment of POWs. And we see the results. You know, an interesting sidebar on that idea that they did not ratify the POW treatment protocol or convention is they actually thought it was unfair because they said that the Japanese soldier would willingly die, which we discussed. So it was actually unfair toward the Japanese soldiers who had to take Allied prisoners. So that was kind of the rationale or justification for not ratifying that part of the treaty, or the convention rather. Ultimately, the Tokyo War Crimes trials, which could be a whole nother activity idea, by the way, is looking into that, since it's much lesser known than the Nuremberg trials, found leadership responsible for killings as they knew what the troops were doing. In fact, the Chinese had notified the Japanese high command several to numerous times of what was taking place. Well, that provides a high-level overview of Japan between 37 and 45, their general attitude and approach, a little bit of a focus on the Rape of Nanking, a little bit of a focus on their chemical biological warfare and medical experimentation, brings in and loops in the ideas of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and provides, I think, 5 different activities. All of this information is located in the folder, along with a brief 5-question survey. Most of the questions are easy: name, date, name of the session that you attended, so session 9 Japan. And then I'm just looking for feedback. It would be helpful. But also because the Florida Department of Education, Commissioner's Task Force on Holocaust Education, and the Merrill Color Educator series would like to see some sort of data to show evidence of people participating. So I would really appreciate it. All you have to do is copy and paste it into an email. Shoot that email to me, Sam, S-A-M, at hmcec.org. That's Sam at hmcec.org. Next up, available as of April 1st, is Russia between 1900 and 1917. I broke Russia into 2 parts. The following session, May 1st, will be Russia 1917 to 1991. The scope is so broad, the country is so huge, the Union, the Soviet Union, was so immense, the numbers killed are so mind-bogglingly large. I had to break this into 2 parts. So that's how we will approach April and May. Then we'll take a fascinating detour to Pakistan in 1971, and that'll get us to June and summer. And we do have some ideas after that, which include the ethnic German expulsions, and then Vietnam, and then North Korea, possibly to today. So that's what we have to look forward to. I would like to thank you for your participation, for supporting us here through participating in these educational endeavors. If you have questions, again, Sam at hmcec.org. And I would like to thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you next time.